I'm not going to get into what I assume everybody here understands, which is a link between petrostates and radical Islam. Let's just kind of jump over that. So many years after 9/11, if it's not clear to anyone, there's nothing I say that will make it clear. I will just give you a brief description of the nature of the solutions we propose before I get into an analysis of the problem. And that is just to say that especially at a time of fiscal distress and a government that has grown way, way too large, any solutions that one talks about when it comes to dealing with the energy security challenge need to be subsidy-free, they need to be technology neutral, and they need to talk about deregulating as opposed to increasing regulation. So without getting into the details of the solution at this point, I just wanted to put that out there and then start talking about the issue that we're actually facing. We issued a new report, the U.S. Energy Security Council issued a new report, which is called Fuel Choice for American Prosperity. And the goal of this report really is to demolish the existing paradigm that exists with respect to thinking about energy security. And that paradigm has been prevalent since trauma that this country experienced 40 years ago, really 40 years ago, in 1973, October, during the Arab oil embargo. The perception of what happened during the embargo was that due to cuts of exports to the U.S., we had oil shortages and people had to stand in line and couldn't get gasoline. That's not what really happened. Oil is a fungible commodity. It's a global market. Think of the oil market as a swimming pool. Producers pour oil in, consumers take oil out. It doesn't matter who you buy your oil from. If all that had happened was that the Saudis and other countries said we're not selling oil to the U.S., it wouldn't have been such a big deal. The U.S. would have bought oil from somebody else. The Saudis would have sold their oil to somebody else, kind of ring around the rosy, and everything's the same. But what actually happened during the embargo that was so damaging to the U.S. and indeed the global economy wasn't the cutoff of exports. It was the fact that OPEC used this opportunity as a first show of force to reset the level of supply to the market. It cut supply to the entire market by 5 million barrels a day. Now you have a global market, supply goes down, demand stays constant, what will happen? Prices go up. Now, I'm sure most people don't remember, but some of you may be aware that before 1973, in the run-up to 1973, the U.S. had instituted price controls really across the economy. We think about price controls and rationing in the Soviet Union, but we forget that we had a similar situation here, and by the way, we still do in some sectors of our economy. But there were price controls across the board, including when it came to fuel. And so you had global oil prices going up, refiners needing to buy expensive oil on the global market, but yet price controls on the gasoline they could sell. They were limited to how much they can charge. A fuel station is limited in how much it can charge by law. Well, for some refiners it was no longer lucrative to sell gasoline, to buy oil and sell gasoline. So we had some dropping off the market. That caused some shortages. The government, of course, doubled up, passed a new law, started to ration. So the shortages, the gas lines, all of that was a result of price controls. It was a result of rationing. And the spike in prices was a result of OPEC reducing supply to the overall market, not cutting off exports to one particular country. And every single country in the world, even countries that were not the so-called targets of the embargo, were suffering from this. Everybody faced these high prices. Okay. So this trauma, the impression that this trauma left with policymakers was as follows. Our oil supply can be disrupted. We're very dependent on the Middle East for oil. The way we need to reduce our vulnerability is to reduce imports. If we reduce imports, we'll be safe. And that reduce imports translated on the left to a drill baby drill mantra, and on the right to Americans are driving cars that are too big. We need to diet. We need more efficiency, fuel efficiency. Maybe we need taxes to reduce the the amount the people drive, and so forth. But in essence, this drill, baby, drill, and the efficiency call are two sides of the same coin. They're the same thing, and I'll explain why. So this paradigm really is completely wrong. First of all, let's see if we can get the PowerPoint to work here. That would be nice. Okay. We'll just do the old-fashioned way. You guys don't mind, right? You don't need to see it all pretty. Well, you can see here that at no point have our imports from the Persian Gulf exceeded 15% of our oil needs. Today we're around 9%. Okay? What we import from the Persian Gulf that's really important is not so much the black liquid itself, it is the price of oil. And I will explain shortly. If we look at what has happened since 2005, then we can see that this obsession with reducing imports has worked. We really reduced imports. Imports fell from some 60% of our needs, over 60% of our oil needs, to under 40% today. And they'll fall further, partially because of this wonderful oil boomlet that we're experiencing with the unconventional oil, the shale oil, partially because of the economic downturn, which reduced industrial uses for oil, and in general people are feeling a little bit poor, so they're driving less, spending less money on fuel, partially because of increased fuel efficiency and other things. So our imports dropped. But what happened to price? Since 2005. Imports dropped, price went up. Well, this looks like a paradox. Of course, it's not really a paradox because we're dealing with a global market. And the U.S., while it's a significant part of the market, is still just a part of a global market. It doesn't, you would think, yes, if in the entire market supply goes up, your domestic production increases, and demand goes down, then you'd expect prices to go down. But we are not the entire global market. We're just part of it. And while supply went up in the U.S. and demand went down in the U.S., that's not what happened worldwide. That's not what happened worldwide. In fact, if you look at what has happened over the past 40 years, then you understand why oil prices are so high despite the fact that not just the U.S. but other non-OPEC countries are drilling and drilling and drilling, more and more and more. OPEC sits on 73% of world conventional oil reserves. Those are, of course, the reserves that are easiest to extract, lowest marginal cost of extraction. You're looking at Saudi Arabia, $2.50 to lift a barrel of oil. Okay, when oil's around $100 a barrel, you're making a nice profit. But what has happened? They're sitting on some 3/4 of world conventional reserves. 40 years ago in 1973, we had a global population of 4 billion. Today it's 7 billion. We had 250 million cars on the road. Today we have 4 times as many in the world, 1 billion. Global GDP has increased 14-fold. Global demand for oil has, of course, increased very much. What's happened to OPEC's production? 40 years ago, they were producing 30 million barrels of oil a day. Today, they're still producing 30 million barrels of oil a day. Folks, this is a fundamental problem that we're facing. 3/4 of the world oil reserves, and they've constrained capacity to the point that they account for just 1/3 of global supply. Now, to understand why this is so bad, imagine that Exxon, Chevron, BP, and Shell were sitting on 3/4 of the world's conventional oil reserves. Do you think they would account for just 1/3 of global supply? There's some of you here that are staffers on the Hill, I know, right? You know very well that not only would the phones in your offices be ringing off the hook, but your bosses would be calling for antitrust action, right? That's what would happen. We can't bring antitrust action against sovereign regimes. That's just the reality. So OPEC, of course, is a cartel. And despite the fact that, you know, it may not be superbly managed or anything like that, it has managed to be quite an effective cartel because of a structural factor in the global oil market, which is that while cartels do cheat, when it comes to oil, you can only cheat in the near and mid-term up to your production capacity. Your production capacity, the rigs that you have laid out, and so forth. And so you can expand production up to your production capacity overnight. You can cheat, go beyond the quota that the cartel decided is appropriate for you. But to cheat beyond that requires a lot of investment and a long time. And therefore, by keeping the production capacity constrained for whatever reason, doesn't have to be malevolence, it can just be inertia, it can just be dumb luck. By keeping its production capacity constrained, that means that the cheating of OPEC simply doesn't matter all that much. And so we have a situation in which they have not expanded their production in 40 years. And despite the growth in demand from developing Asia, a third of the world doesn't want to ride bicycles anymore. Hundreds of millions of people rapidly lifting themselves out of poverty. OPEC's production has not grown in sync. This is why prices are so high. They would be much, much lower if it was investor-owned companies that sat on this resource. Now, here's the big issue that we're facing. We hear a lot about the unconventional oil and gas boom in the U.S. And as I'll explain later, it's not the oil boom part of the oil and gas boom that's going to affect the oil market at all, unfortunately. We have a chance for that gas boom part to affect the oil market, but not for the oil boom. The reason is as follows. Our counterpart is a cartel. Okay, so what happens when non-OPEC countries drill more? What can a cartel do in response to keep the supply-demand relationship tight? Drill less, right? Very simple. They don't actually have to do that because we have China and India entering the market, but let's say China and India didn't exist, they could simply drill less. They sit on their hands and they get the same effect. In the same way, if we use less by, for example, increasing fuel efficiency, what can the cartel do in response? Drill less, right? So we drill more, they can drill less. We use less, they can drill less. That's why the oil and boom, while it's terrific for the regions in which this oil is being produced, a lot of trickle-down positive economic effects. You know, industrial activity is always good. It's terrific for that reason, that it's industrial activity. But it has zero impact on energy security. Our problem with energy security is not a physical disruption of supply. It's a fact that the price of oil is very high, and we haven't been able to do anything to dampen it down. All right. What is a bigger deal than the oil boom? A bigger deal was the Arab Spring. Arab Spring is one of the biggest factors that's going to be impacting the oil market going forward. Why? Well, when Mubarak was toppled, Saudi King Abdullah was in New York recovering from back injury, and he rushed home, and not wanting to have the palaces stormed, he and the rest of his cohorts in the Gulf drastically increased grants to their subjects, increased subsidies for food and for fuel, increased salaries for government employees. Now remember that the subjects of the Gulf regimes, you have a lot of expats living there, but the subjects of the Gulf regimes themselves mostly work for the government. And the government salary is 4 times the private sector salary in Saudi Arabia. When you increase salary to government employees, you are increasing spending in a structural and long-lasting way. You can't roll it back without risking stability. So drastically increase spending. Now, when you increase subsidies for fuel, what's going to happen? You subsidize something, people use more of it, right? You subsidize transportation fuel, people use more of it. You subsidize electricity, people use more of it. Now, electricity in the U.S. and most of the world is not generated from oil. In the U.S., only 1% of our electricity is generated from oil, and only 1% of our oil demand is due to electricity. Everybody knows this, right? You know that we can build nuclear power plants to our heart's content, and if that's what rocks your boat, solar panels and wind turbines, it's not going to impact oil demand at all. But in Saudi Arabia and in the rest of the Gulf, they generate electricity from oil. And so when they increase subsidies for electricity, people are going to use more electricity, which means they're using more electricity generated from oil, which means they're using more oil. So what does all this add up to? Your budgetary expenditures are increasing. You actually care about balancing your budget. So your revenue has to go up. Now, what is the revenue to your regime? Oil sales. Now you have a choice. You can sell more oil at a lower cost per barrel, or you can sell less oil at a higher cost per barrel. Being a cartel, what do you prefer to do? You prefer to sell less oil at a higher cost per barrel, plus, we just said your domestic consumption of oil is increasing very much. That 30 million barrels a day that OPEC contributes to the global oil market, more and more of that 30 million barrels a day is staying home in OPEC countries. It's consumed at home. Saudi Arabia has a smaller population than France and Canada, okay? France and Canada are major industrial powers. It consumes more oil than either. It's the 6th largest consumer of oil in the world. That's astounding. So that means you're going to sell less oil at a higher cost per barrel. You need to hit your what's called fiscal break-even price of oil. This has nothing to do with the break-even price that you think of for a company. You know, the price you have to sell something at to match your costs. It has nothing to do with it. Like I said, it's $2.50 to lift a barrel in Saudi Arabia. What this has to do with, the fiscal break-even price of oil, is the price of oil required to balance the national budget of Saudi Arabia and of other OPEC regimes. And if you listen to OPEC and you hear announcements of OPEC, they say this is the fair price of oil. Okay, in the 90s, the Saudi petroleum minister said the fair price of oil was al-Naimi, $20 a barrel. What is it today? $90 to $100 a barrel, right? What is the fair price of oil? The fair price of oil is the fiscal break-even price of oil. What is OPEC's target price of oil? OPEC's target price for oil, this is one of the best predictors for where oil price will go. And of course, nothing goes up straight. It goes up like this, but it goes to that price. OPEC's target price of oil is the fiscal break-even price for the pricing doves within OPEC. Pricing dove like Saudi Arabia, that has, compared to other countries like Iran, a lower fiscal break-even price. So let's compare here, right here. Look. See there? See Saudi's the big red blob there? That's Saudi Arabia. That's your fiscal break-even price for Saudi Arabia. And that brown blob on the right is Iran. Iran has a much higher fiscal break-even price. They need 150 to balance their budget. Okay, so that's why Saudi Arabia is a dove in OPEC. So this is where OPEC needs the price to go. And if you looked at these numbers here, going forward, I'm not even going to quote them because they're so nasty, but they're very, very, very high. And that's bad, 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 bad news for the global economy because these are the folks that have the oil. Now, I'm going to cut this off pretty shortly, because I know we have other speakers. All I want to say is the following, and we can talk about solutions more in the Q&A and our policy proposals if y'all are interested. I said the gas part of the oil and gas boom has tremendous potential for our country. What we need to do to drive the price of oil down is to force oil into competition with other energy commodities. Okay? We need commodity arbitrage. And we need commodity arbitrage in the transportation fuel market. We're not seeing that today. We're not seeing that today because most cars can only run on petroleum, on oil-based fuel, gasoline or diesel. If cars were open to fuel competition, and again, the policies that we propose are no subsidies, they amount to deregulation, to simplifying regulation, to rolling back a lot of the regulation that's out there today. We were beating our heads against the wall for the past 10 years with a mandate, and we've decided that's not going to fly. You can read your Hayek and your Friedman and all you want, but for some reason on the Hill, the fact that both Hayek and Milton Friedman believe that there's a role for aggressive action in combating cartels and monopolies doesn't necessarily get you any traction. So our approach is forget the mandate, focus on rolling back policies that exist today, even though that's a second best and less elegant option. We have a lot of cheap natural gas. We have a lot of cheap coal. We can't really access that coal because of environmental regulations. But if we look at that natural gas, then what we can see is if we open cars to fuels made from that natural gas, we put natural gas into competition with oil. Okay, now there are a number of ways that you can do that. Some are really expensive on the vehicle side and not likely to appeal to consumers. For example, you can take that natural gas and compress it as CNG. The fuel is really cheap, the car is really expensive. It's $5,000 to $10,000 more expensive than a gasoline-only car, okay? You can take that natural gas, you can use it to generate electricity, and you can use that electricity in plug-in hybrid and electric vehicles, okay? Electric vehicles are really fun to drive. If you haven't driven some of the sporty electric vehicles, you don't know what you're missing if you are a person that enjoys driving, but they're still very expensive, okay? You can take that natural gas and you can convert it to liquid fuels. When people think of this, they think gas to liquids, they think synthetic petroleum products like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel made from natural gas. Pretty expensive. Or you can take that natural gas and you can make alcohol from it. When we think of alcohol, we think ethanol, but the fact is that the alcohol methanol can be made from natural gas, it can be made from coal, and in fact, China, that doesn't have the same environmental regulations that we do, and strangely enough looks at economics with a lot more clear eye than we do, has a huge, huge transportation fuel market for methanol made from coal, and not just a huge transportation fuel market, but rampant illegal fuel blending, because the fuel is so much cheaper as compared to gasoline on an energy unit basis, as you can see here. That's what you're looking at here, energy unit basis, apples to apples comparison. Different fuels have different energy densities per gallon, so you're not comparing the cost per gallon, you're not comparing the miles per gallon. What you want to compare is the cost per energy unit, the cost per mile. That's the only way to do an apples to apples comparison. The bottom line is that a flex fuel vehicle that can use gasoline and a variety of alcohol fuels costs less than $100 extra to make as compared to a gasoline-only car. Okay, it's a very minor cost. The fuel is a lot cheaper. Fuel stations enjoy a much larger margin on it than they do on gasoline because the wholesale cost is so low. So it's a win-win across the board. There's a huge chicken and egg issue. Okay? How do you overcome the chicken and egg issue? I'll just give you one highlight from our policy proposals. What we say is we have an existing CAFE system. The fuel efficiency standards that were put in place after the oil embargo and were increased drastically in recent years. They are very, very difficult for auto companies to meet. Having to hit 54 miles a gallon is going to be really, really expensive for auto companies. That's the existing law. Now, what we propose is making it easier for auto companies to meet their existing fuel efficiency standards as follows. Saying to an auto company, if most of the new cars in your fleet are open to fuel competition in some way, whatever you choose, whatever way you choose, CNG, electrified vehicle, biodiesel, what the heck. If you make it a flex fuel, you can't just do gasoline ethanol though. For it to count, it has to be gasoline ethanol methanol. But if at least half of the vehicles in your fleet are open to fuel competition, then towards that top line CAFE number that you have to meet, you'll get a whole bunch of credit. Let's say 3 or 4 miles. So instead of having to hit 54, you'll have to hit, say, 50 or 51. This is a big deal for auto companies. It saves them a lot of money, and it means a lot in terms of their sales. And Frank, I see you standing there, so I'm going to cut this off right here, and glad to talk to any of you afterwards in the Q&A. Thank you.
Let me just ask about one thing. You alluded to the possibilities of cars being able to be run on ethanol, methanol, as well as gasoline. Talk a little bit about how far we are from the automotive fleet that we operate today having such a capability. It's my understanding that it's not something that necessarily has to be built in new cars going forward, that there is some existing capability if only we can take advantage of it. What are the impediments to taking advantage of it, if that's correct?
Yeah, the average American isn't going to put a fuel in a car if the vehicle is not warranted to use that fuel. So you have 2 issues here. One is the vehicle has to be warranted to use the fuel for consumers to feel comfortable using it and for fuel stations to feel that they're free of liability selling that fuel. The other question is, okay, technically, what can the cars actually use? And, you know, folks like Bob Zubrin have gone through the vehicle technical specs and said, well, a lot of these cars out there, because of economies of scale, they share parts with cars that we know are warranted to use these fuels. So technically, these cars could use the fuel. The autos just haven't gone through the warranty the warranty testing process and dealt with the EPA and all this. We tend to look at this from the conservative side, and we say if the auto companies say the cars can't use the fuel, fine. Looking part by part, you look at the MIT Automotive Lab and they'll list the parts for you. You're basically, alcohol is more corrosive than gasoline. It's bad for the plastic seals. You need higher grade plastic seals and so forth. Anything that touches the alcohol needs to be able to handle it. And you need to download a different piece of software to a control chip in the car. That's all it takes to make a vehicle flex fuel. That's under $100 a car. If you look at the high estimate.
A new car.
And in fact, if we look at China, okay, what do you think is GM's most important market, the US or China? It's China, right? We are a mature market. The Chinese market is just on its upward trajectory now. They sold more cars in China last year than in the US. So in China, de facto, you have to be able to use alcohol in your car because that's what's in many, many provinces in China, starting in the coal provinces, that's what people are buying because it's cheaper. So if your car can't use it, your car is going to be ruined. People are buying it. They don't really care if their car is warranted to use it or not.
But more to the point, what I was told at your meeting last week by one of the Methanol Institute representatives was, in fact, the autos are honoring
Yes.
their warranties, even where they're using up to 15% methanol in China.
That's right.
Is that correct?
We know that the autos selling cars in China, and that's every major auto company, the cars they are going to make, whether they declare or not, are going to be flex fuel, gasoline, ethanol, methanol in China, just as they are in Brazil. Brazil, people think ethanol, sugarcane ethanol. The fact is the flex fuels cars in Brazil can run on methanol too. So you're going to have a situation where, you look at the U.S., Brazil, China, that's 50% of the global auto market right there. So Brazil has fuel competition. China will have fuel competition. The U.S. won't. And Frank, the most important thing to think about is what happens when investors know that cars rolling onto the roads will be fuel competitive. They look at the energy resources, they look at the technologies that are available, they look at what they expect the price of oil to be, and then they expand capacity in production of fuels from which they think they can make money. So, for example, I just gave that one example of methanol from natural gas, but you can expect a drastic capacity expansion. With enough capacity expansion, you eventually get to a situation we don't have today. Today, OPEC effectively acts as a monopolist in the global oil market. Okay, lowest marginal cost of production, biggest reserves, yet constraining capacity. Because of the petroleum-only vehicle, it also acts as a monopolist in the transportation fuel market. If you open that market to competition, all of a sudden, you get competition over market share, right? In a normal profit-making opportunity, lots of companies jump in until that profit-making opportunity goes down, right? That's what happens in a chocolate market, in the computer market, everywhere. You don't have abnormal profits, right? You only have abnormal profits when there's a monopolist situation or regulation keeping entrants out. So what happens? Competition over substitutable products is waged over price. You eventually hit an equilibrium price among all these competing fuels. That means the price of oil gets dragged down, the price of natural gas, of coal gets dragged up, and you're talking about a price band of, let's say, around $50 a barrel for oil, $45 to $50 a barrel for oil, and maybe $7 for natural gas, which is a much better situation for the U.S. than we have today.
So what does that do, that price break-even point for all
Well,
those
that's bad
other
news
bad guys?
bad news for the Saudis and for some of the other Gulf regimes.
Notably Iran.
Especially Iran.
Iran.
It's not something that can happen overnight. This is going to take time. But if we don't start, then we're just going to be in a worse and worse position going forward.
Right. It's them or us. Yes, sir.
Can you share your thoughts on the terrain for getting these policies enacted and the lessons from previous efforts, the Open Fuel Standard Act that has been introduced in the past, now has been reintroduced again by Congressman Engel. What's your assessment of the likelihoods and the challenges of getting the Congress and the President to move ahead with this?
The Open Fuel Standard was introduced repeatedly over many Congresses, always by bipartisan folks in the House and the Senate. The problem we always ran up against, especially with folks on the right, was this is a mandate. Now, I can run through the list of people that voted for the digital television mandate and seem to have no problem with that because TV is really strategic to our American way of life. And along with that, voted for a subsidy, I think, of $150 for set-top boxes for those people that didn't buy digital TVs. But they had their rear end kicked in, rightly so, by small government advocates, Tea Party, kind of trying to wake up our politicians here. And one of the results that you have is a lot of our, and forgive me guys on the Hill, please, okay, I'm not speaking against any of your bosses, I'm speaking in general, completely abstract. A lot of folks on the Hill that are on the right, I don't think come from basic principles when it comes to free market issues. But they now have a constituency that does come from basic principles on free market issues. And so they have to mouth platitudes. They don't necessarily understand the free market all the way to the bottom. So they didn't read Hayek. They didn't read Friedman. They don't understand that, yes, there's a case for breaking monopolies and cartels. There's a case for Teddy Roosevelt-style trust busting. And if you can't do antitrust action, you can do something else. And what's the least bad thing you can do? These arguments didn't fly. And so the open fuel standard just didn't get anywhere time after time, no traction, because it was a mandate. So we said, fine, enough hitting our head against the wall. Let's try a different way. Any politician on the right that said the reason we don't support the open fuel standard is because it's a mandate, but we think fuel competition is a great idea, there is zero reason not to support an approach that says ease regulation on auto companies by giving them an option, not something they have to do, but an option of an easier way to meet the existing very stringent CAFE standards. If you don't support that, then there's something else that's driving you, you know, but it's certainly not free market thinking, because the enemy of the perfect, the enemy of the good is the perfect.
Right.
It would require legislation because there ain't no way that the EPA is going to do this on its own. It could, but we will see. I believe that I believe the answer to that will be yes, but we will see.
Claire?
What do you think is going to be the effect on OPEC and the rest of the international oil markets when Israel's huge new finds in oil and gas come online?
You know, I have to tell you, there is a lot of nonsense floating around when it comes to energy policy and energy in general, and that's one of the biggest myths. Israel does not have a huge reserves of oil. What it does have are offshore substantial reserves of natural gas. Okay? And that natural gas, if it uses it appropriately, can be very useful to it for strategic reasons. They can use it to prop up the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, for instance. They can use it to firm up other relationships in the region. But zero impact on the global oil market, zero. And anybody who talks about, here's one of the issues that I think has been confusing a lot of people. People don't understand what shale oil and oil shale and all of these things are, okay? The oil that we are producing in the U.S. right now from shale is actually liquid oil. It's tight oil. It's liquid oil that's in the shale oil formations. When people talk about shale rock in Israel and in other parts of the world, what they're talking about is an actual rock. You have to take that rock. There's no liquid in there. You have to take that rock and crush it to make liquid out of it. That is super duper expensive. Okay? That ain't happening in the near term. It's not happening in the midterm. And depending on the volatility of oil price, it may not happen in the long term. And we should hope that oil price doesn't get high enough that it will happen in the long term, because then we're all going to be up a creek without a paddle.
I think we've got to move on. We'll take one last question, then we'll move to our next speaker.
Yeah, I'll make it a quick one. You're talking about the Chinese market and methanol being used there. I was wondering, what kind of blend do they use, and does it actually affect the price of the pump compared to what we pay here?
So very interesting. You know, China has a provincial system. So like we have states, they have provinces. And there's a lot of independence across the provinces. So you see a lot of different things happening across the provinces. The methanol in China is really driven by the basic economics, not by the government, okay? And so you see different blends selling in different parts of the country, depending on how close they are to the coal areas, because the coal areas are where they're building the methanol plants. So you see everything from taxis using M100, which is just neat alcohol, 100% alcohol. You see blends of M15 proliferating in the further areas. That's just like 15% methanol, 85% gasoline, and everything in between, M85, M30, you know, everything in between. Consumer-driven,